The Day of Mourning. Key dates and people. The Day of Mourning was a protest held by Aboriginal Australians on the 26th of January 1938, the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the First Fleet, which marked the beginning of colonisation of Australia. The Day of Mourning was organised by the Aboriginal Progressive Association with the support of Aboriginal Advancement League. Key leaders involved in the protest included Uncle William Cooper, Pastor Doug Nichols, Auntie Margaret Tucker, and Auntie Pearl Gibbs. On the right is an image of Uncle William Cooper. Aims and objectives of the protest. The protesters' intention was to bring awareness to their unjust treatments as Indigenous Australians, to gain support for their proposal to dismantle the protection boards then operating and extending full citizen rights to Aboriginal people. It was done to inform white Australian citizens that may have been unaware or ignored the treatment Aboriginal Australians were receiving. Methods used during the protest to create change. They mourned the loss of their country, their freedom and self-determination, and the deaths of so many of their kind. A parade and a reenactment of the landing of the first fleet of ships bringing people from Britain to Australia. After the parade finished, over 1,000 Aboriginal people and their supporters took part in a silent march through the streets of Sydney. Impact on First Nations people and non-First Nations people. The Day of Mourning and protest made an impact, achieving both media attention and an agreement by the Prime Minister to receive a deputation of delegates. The day also saw an appalling contrast. Aboriginal organisations in Sydney refused to participate in the government's reenactment of the events of January 1788. By reaching media attention, the protests became big and showed non-First Nations people what actually happened. White Australians looked at this as a chance to support them. For First Nations people, this made a huge impact. It became a very important part of their story. Overall significance of the protest. It was the first national gathering of Indigenous people protesting the prejudice and discrimination that was a daily part of their lives and marked the beginning of the modern Aboriginal political movement. The Day of Mourning was the first time Aboriginal activist groups from different states had fully cooperated. While it may have seemed to be a protest that came out of the blue for many non-Indigenous Australians, the political activity that occurred on the Day of Mourning in Sydney had been building for quite some time. Marking the Day of Mourning became an annual event for Indigenous people and their supporters. The Sunday before Australia Day was set aside, but over time this was shifted to July and eventually evolved into NAIDOC Week. Overall significance of the protest continued. Australia Day is also referred to as Invasion Day or Survival Day, particularly by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. This is because it celebrates a painful part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. The Day of Mourning taught First Nations people how to protest in new methods that weren't violent. The protests created new leaders for Aboriginal people, and it showed white Sydneyans the struggles of Aboriginals they didn't realise, and they found this out through newspaper. These protests had raised awareness.